Hospice nurse dies, what she saw on the other side will amaze you. There was no warning, no time to prepare. One moment, Grace Davis was going about her work as a hospice nurse, tending to her patients, holding their hands, offering comfort during their final days, and the next moment, she was lying on the cold, hard floor of the nurse's station. Her vision blurred as her body convulsed, a sharp pain seizing her chest. It felt like everything inside her was shattering, as if her very being was fracturing into pieces. "Grace?" A voice echoed from somewhere, distant and muffled. "Grace." But the sound was fading, pulling away as if she were sinking deeper into a void. Her body, her physical self, felt heavy, immobilized, but her mind was racing. The pain was sharp, unbearable, but there was something else. Something strange, something unfamiliar. She felt detached from it all, as though she was watching herself from a distance, unable to intervene, unable to move. Her eyes closed. It wasn't long before everything faded. The first thing Grace noticed when she opened her eyes again was the absence of the hospital's sterile, white walls, the machines, the quiet hum of life support. Instead, she found herself in a place that seemed impossible, a vast, open expanse. She blinked, unsure of what she was seeing. Was she dreaming? Was this some strange vision her mind was conjuring? This was real. The colors around her were too vivid, the air too clear, and the sense of space was too expansive to be just a dream. The light, a soft, golden glow, bathed everything around her, but it wasn't harsh. It wasn't artificial. It felt natural, like it was a part of the fabric of this place. Grace took a step, unsure if she could even move, if her body even existed in this place. But she was aware. She was present. And yet, there was no pain. No aching joints, no fatigue, no discomfort. Almost weightless. As she stood there, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, she saw something in the distance. A figure, a shape, moving toward her through the golden light. It was a man, tall and radiant, but not in any way Grace could describe. No features, no defining characteristics like a person in the physical world. It was as if the light itself had formed around him, becoming part of him, and he radiated warmth, peace, and power. "Grace," the figure said softly, his voice deep, calming, yet familiar in a way that made her heart race. She knew that voice. She couldn't explain it, but she knew it. It felt like it had been with her for longer than her life itself. "You've been called," he continued, his voice like a soft melody. "And now you're here." Her breath caught in her throat. "Where am I?" she whispered, unsure if she should even speak, unsure of what was happening. Her mind was spinning. The man's face, if that's what it was, did not change expression, but his presence filled the air, making it feel like there was nothing but him. "You are beyond. You are no longer in your world. You have crossed over to where the living cannot reach, where the veil between life and death is thinnest. Welcome to the other side." Grace's mind reeled. The other side? She had died? She couldn't wrap her mind around it. She had been just a few steps away from her patients, helping them breathe easier in their last days. But now she was here. She was dead. The weight of the realization hit her like a tidal wave, and she felt her knees buckle beneath her. But the man was there, a presence, a force that kept her steady without touching her. She didn't fall. She didn't collapse. It was as if the world around her was holding her up, supporting her, like it had always known this moment would come. "Why am I here?" Grace asked, her voice trembling, her thoughts swirling like a storm inside her. "What is this place? Why did this happen?" "You have crossed into the realm beyond your own," he said, his tone softer now, though there was an unmistakable gravity in his words. "You've come to understand the truth of existence, the purpose of life and death. You've spent your days caring for others, easing their pain, but now it is your turn to learn." Grace stared at him, her heart pounding. "Learn what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head slightly, the golden light swirling around him in a dance of shadows and brilliance. "You've seen people die. You've been with them as they crossed over, but now you will see it for yourself. You will learn of the path that leads beyond, and the truth of what awaits. Grace's chest tightened. She had seen so many people pass in her time as a hospice nurse. She had held their hands as they took their final breaths, offered them comfort as they slipped into the next world, whatever that was. But she had could never have imagined this. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure did not answer immediately, letting the silence stretch between them. It felt like an eternity, but it wasn't a painful silence. It was filled with understanding, with a quiet patience that made Grace feel small, but not in a bad way. It was as if the answer was already known, as if it had always been there, but she needed time to understand it. "Because you've been a witness," the figure finally said. "Because you've spent your life helping others find peace. Now, it's your turn to understand what lies beyond. You will see it all. You will learn the truth about life, about death, about the purpose of it all." A deep, unsettling silence hung between them again, and Grace realized that she was now more alone than she had ever felt. No longer bound by the limitations of her earthly body, no longer constrained by the questions she had carried through her life, she was free to truly understand the depths of what she had witnessed, what she had never dared to imagine. But at that moment, Grace wasn't sure if she was ready to know. Grace could hardly process what was happening. Standing in this ethereal realm, she was frozen between the familiarity of the life she had lived and the alien nature of the space she found herself in. She could feel the warmth radiating from the figure before her, but it wasn't like any warmth she had ever known. It wasn't of this world. It wasn't like the comfort she had given to her patients or the quiet hand she'd held as they took their final breaths. No, this was something different. It was more encompassing, more vast than anything she had ever experienced. Her feet, bare against a soft, almost fabric-like ground, seemed to sink just a little with each step she took. There was no need for balance, though. Her body felt light, unburdened by the weight of muscles, the pull of gravity. She could breathe easily, effortlessly, and yet something told her it wasn't the air she was used to. This wasn't the atmosphere of Earth, not the air that kept her lungs alive. She wasn't alive anymore. Still, she wasn't entirely sure she understood what that meant. She had worked as a hospice nurse for years, standing by people as they crossed over to whatever came next. But now, standing in this infinite, unfamiliar space, she didn't know what it meant to be dead. There was no burning fire or churning darkness. There was no white light leading her toward a promise of peace. Everything about this place was unexplainable, beyond anything her mind could grasp. The figure who had greeted her didn't move as she processed the reality of it all. He stood perfectly still, radiating light without effort, his expression unreadable. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment to unfold, as if he had known it would come to pass. "You've seen the other side," the man said quietly, breaking the silence that had enveloped them. His voice was smooth and commanding but gentle, like a calm river flowing through a troubled mind. "But now you must learn what happens before the end. What must be understood before the choices you have made come to their conclusion." Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "What choices? I'm just a nurse. I was just doing my job. I didn't choose this." His expression softened, but the power of his gaze only seemed to grow. "You may not have chosen the life you lived, but every soul has its path to follow. You have crossed a threshold, and in doing so, you will learn what comes after. For you, for others, for everything." Grace stepped back slightly, unsure of how to react. She tried to look at him for some kind of explanation, but his eyes held her in place. The longer she stared, the less she understood, and the more she felt the weight of what he was saying. It wasn't a simple afterlife she had entered. She had crossed into something deeper, a space between what was and what would be. There was a finality to it all, but also an ongoing movement, a shift that she could not yet understand. I don't understand," she said again, her voice cracking. "What is this place? Why am I here?" The man's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't kind. It was a smile that seemed to hold years of understanding, years of truth. "This place is where you begin to know," he said. "Where the answers you seek will come to you. But you must first face what you have chosen." The question that burned in Grace's mind wasn't the same as before. It wasn't just, "Why am I here?" It was, "What is it that I've chosen?" She had been living her life trying to bring peace to others, trying to ease their suffering, yet here she stood in a place that seemed to be filled with nothing but questions. And the weight of those questions was suffocating her. "You've seen the patterns in the world," the figure continued. "The world is fractured, Grace. The suffering you've witnessed, the pain you've tried to ease, is only a small reflection of the greater sickness. A sickness that has been festering for centuries. People have been blind to the truth, and the time has come to open their eyes." She felt a shiver run down her spine as the man's words cut through her thoughts. "Blind?" she echoed. "What do you mean by that? What truth are you talking about?" He did not immediately answer, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. Instead, he reached out his hand toward her, his fingers glowing with the same ethereal light that seemed to permeate this place. "Come," he said. "Let me show you." Reluctantly, Grace took a step forward, though she wasn't sure if she was moving toward him or if she was simply being pulled. She felt the energy around them shift as he led her to the edge of the open space where they stood. The landscape was still formless, as if they were suspended in time itself, yet in the distance, Grace saw something she couldn't quite make out but could feel drawing her in. It was an impression, like a fleeting memory, but more real than anything she had felt in her physical life. The man continued, his voice steady as ever. "This world, the world you lived in, is not as it appears. What you've seen in your lifetime, the pain, the death, it's all connected to something much larger. A cycle that has been repeating itself for generations. People struggle, they fight, they strive for meaning, but they miss the truth right in front of them. Their ignorance feeds the cycle, and the cycle continues." "Why?" Grace asked, the words spilling out before she could stop it. "Why does it keep happening? Why does it have to be like this?" The man's face darkened ever so slightly. "Because the truth is too difficult to bear. The world cannot see what lies beneath the surface. They are blinded by their desires, their needs, their egos. They ignore the signs, the warning signs. The world's fate is not sealed by nature, but by its own choices." As the man spoke, the images around them began to shift once more. Grace could feel the ground beneath her pulse with an otherworldly energy. The air around her began to crackle with a kind of power, and suddenly, she was no longer in the formless void. She was seeing glimpses of the world, scenes of devastation, of suffering, of loss. These weren't images of the past. They weren't of the future either. They were happening now. All around her, across the earth, people were fighting. They were divided, separated by walls of fear, hatred, and greed. "You see," the man whispered, his voice barely audible against the growing storm of images. "It is not fate that leads them to destruction. It is their choice. The world is collapsing, not because of some cosmic punishment, but because humanity refuses to look at the truth. And as long as they remain blind, the cycle will continue. This is what you must understand." Grace felt the ground beneath her tremble as the images grew darker, more intense. The world she had once known was collapsing, not from external forces, but from the decisions made by those within it. Her heart sank as she realized just how deeply entrenched the suffering was. It wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. It wasn't something she could solve with kindness, with care. The images faded into darkness, and Grace stood there, her breath quickening, the weight of everything she had just witnessed pressing on her chest. The truth was now clear. It was more horrifying than anything she had ever imagined. "I can't stop it," she whispered. "Can I?" Grace felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The images she had just witnessed, the suffering, the division, the chaos, played in her mind like a loop she couldn't escape. She had always thought of herself as someone who could bring comfort, someone who could make a difference, but now, standing in the wake of what she had seen, she felt small, insignificant. What good was kindness in a world already spiraling toward its own collapse? What difference did it make when no one seemed to care enough to stop the destruction? The man who had been guiding her through this strange, unsettling journey stood in front of her, watching her with an expression of calm detachment. His eyes, those endless, dark eyes, seemed to hold more than just pity. There was something darker there, something that suggested he knew the future with a certainty that sent a shiver through her. "What happens now?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. She had to know. She had to understand what her role was in all of this. She couldn't just stand here, paralyzed by fear and confusion. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, his gaze piercing. It was as if he was weighing her, measuring her worth, her resolve, before offering any explanation. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Grace found herself holding her breath, waiting for him to speak. "The truth you've seen," he began, his voice steady, "is only part of the picture. What you witnessed, the collapse of humanity, the suffering, it's just one possibility, one path. But it is the path that humanity is walking toward unless something changes. Unless they see the truth for themselves." His words struck her with a heavy weight, but she didn't understand. One path? What did he mean by that? How could something that devastating, something so final, possibly be changed? "See the truth," she repeated, her voice cracking with disbelief. "You're telling me that it's not too late? That we can change it?" The figure nodded, but the gesture didn't bring her any comfort. "It is too late for some," he said, his voice cold, almost regretful. "The ones who refuse to see, who refuse to change, have already sealed their fate. But there is still time, for others. For those who are willing to accept the truth." Grace took a step back, the weight of his words crashing down on her. Time for others? She thought of the people she had cared for during her years as a hospice nurse, the ones who had passed peacefully, who had accepted their fate. They hadn't had time to change. And yet, she had thought they had found some kind of peace. But now, standing here, in this strange, suspended place, she wasn't sure what peace meant anymore. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something the figure wasn't telling her. His words didn't add up. There had to be more. There had to be more to this than just accepting the inevitable. "So, what do we do?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost desperate. "How do we change it? How do we make sure it doesn't happen?" The figure turned his gaze from her, looking out into the vast nothingness surrounding them. "There are others like you," he said, his voice carrying a weight she couldn't quite grasp. "Others who have been shown pieces of the truth, who have been given the opportunity to understand the consequences of their choices. But they too must face the truth. They must wake up." Grace stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. Others like me? Who are these people? Were they like her, witnesses to the unraveling of humanity? Or were they something else? Something more powerful? "How do we wake them up?" she asked, her voice growing more urgent. "How do we make them see?" The man's gaze returned to her, but there was no comfort in his expression. They must see for themselves. There is no force that can make them believe. The truth must come from within. Only then can the change begin. Grace's heart sank. But what if they don't see? What if they don't listen? "There will be consequences," he replied, his tone cold. "The choice has always been theirs to make. And now, the time has come for them to face it." She stood there, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket of stone. She felt paralyzed, as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss, unsure of whether she could take a step forward. The future, the truth, seemed so far out of her reach. She wasn't a prophet, not a leader, just a nurse. What could she do to stop something so monumental, so inevitable? The figure seemed to sense her hesitation, and his expression softened slightly. "You've seen it, Grace. You've been given the vision of what will happen if nothing changes. It is your choice now. You can remain a bystander, or you can find a way to make them see." His words cut through her, more piercing than before. "It's my choice?" That was the part she had been waiting for. The moment where everything could shift, where the possibility of hope, however faint, could arise. But what did it mean to make them see? She wasn't sure what she could offer. She had no powers, no influence. She was just one person, one life, in a world full of people. How could she make a difference? "What do I do?" she asked again, her voice barely more than a whisper. The figure's eyes darkened slightly, and for the first time, Grace sensed a shift in the atmosphere around them. The calm, controlled presence he had exuded was replaced with something more urgent, something darker. He stepped closer to her, his voice now low, almost threatening. "Time is running out," he said, his words edged with an undeniable finality. "The more you wait, the more you hesitate, the further you fall into the same trap as those who have already sealed their fate. There will be no second chance. No more opportunities. You must act. The moment to change is now." His words were like a crack of thunder, and they reverberated in Grace's chest, making her heart race faster. What had seemed like a distant threat was now closing in on her. She could feel the urgency, the pressure building, but she still didn't know what she was supposed to do. "Change," she whispered. "How? What change can I make?" "You will know," the figure replied simply before turning away. "In time, you will know." And with that, he began to fade, his figure dissolving into the bright light that surrounded them. Grace stood there alone once again, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was gone, but his words hung in the air, heavier than before. What could she do? What was her purpose in all of this? As the light dimmed slightly around her, Grace felt more uncertain than ever. The questions remained unanswered, and the weight of her decision loomed over her like a shadow. Grace felt herself sink into the eerie stillness that surrounded her, her mind racing. She had just been told something beyond her understanding, and yet it was becoming clearer than ever. This wasn't some dream, some fantastical vision. No, this was real. And there was no going back. She had been shown the end, what awaited the world if humanity didn't change its ways. She had witnessed the destruction, the suffering, the collapse of everything she had ever known, and now she had to somehow do something about it. But what? She wasn't a leader, she wasn't a prophet. She was just a nurse. What could she possibly do to prevent this calamity, this inevitable fate that was bearing down on the world like a massive storm? The figure had vanished, leaving her in the silence of the otherworldly space. Grace was alone again, except for the swirling, constant hum of a force she couldn't see but could feel. The golden light that surrounded her felt alive, as if it was breathing, pulsing in sync with her own heart. She clenched her fists, her thoughts a tangled mess of doubt and anger. "I've been shown this. I've been told it's my responsibility. But why her? Why wasn't she like everyone else? Just a nurse, helping people in their final moments? Why had she been pulled into this, into whatever this was? Was she supposed to be some sort of savior? Was she supposed to fight back against the inevitable? The very thought of it made her feel like an imposter. She wasn't some warrior. She didn't have the knowledge to lead a revolution, to change the course of the world. But then, what was this knowledge for? If she was just meant to be a witness, then what was the point? Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the sweat from her forehead, the air around her warm but strangely uncomfortable. The more she thought about it, the more disconnected she felt from the life she had known. Her patients, those faces that she had cared for, loved, and held as they crossed into whatever waited for them, seemed so distant now. Their stories, their deaths, now felt meaningless, as if they had been just a part of some larger, more terrifying scheme. "Why do you make it so hard?" she whispered to the empty air, though she wasn't sure if she was asking the figure who had been there, or something greater, something more distant. "Why don't you just tell me what to do?" There was no answer. Only the silence, only the pressure building in her chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared before, the figure returned. He materialized out of thin air, standing before her, silent as ever, with a piercing gaze that seemed to see through her. "You've been given the truth, Grace," he said, his voice cutting through her thoughts like a knife. "But the truth is not enough. The world cannot be saved by knowledge alone. It takes more. It takes action." She stepped back, confusion flooding her mind. "Action?" she repeated, almost incredulously. "What kind of action? What am I supposed to do?" The man's lips twitched slightly as though he were almost amused by her disbelief. "You must be the one to carry this truth. To let it spread, to let it take root in others. But only if they are ready. Only if they can hear you." She stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice desperate now, the weight of her confusion finally breaking through. "How am I supposed to get anyone to listen? How do I make them see what I've seen?" The man's gaze softened for the first time since she had met him, but it was not a comforting softness. It was a cold, resigned understanding, as though he already knew what was coming. "The truth is a flame, Grace," he said quietly. "It will ignite, but only in those who are willing to see it. You cannot force others to understand. You cannot make them open their eyes. You can only show them. You can only speak the truth and let them decide if they are ready to listen." Her breath hitched as she tried to process what he was saying. Speak the truth? That's it? It felt so simple, so trivial. But there was something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, that made her question everything she thought she knew. "But if they don't listen, what happens then?" she asked, her voice trembling with a new fear. "What happens if they don't see? If they can't?" The man's face hardened again, his eyes narrowing. "Then the world will continue its downward spiral," he said, his voice colder than before. "The suffering will grow. The destruction will reach further. And the cycle will continue until there is nothing left. Until everything you have known is gone." His words struck like a physical blow. Marie felt herself stumbling back, the weight of them almost too much to bear. Nothing left? It felt so final, so bleak. What kind of hope was there in a world where no one would listen? Where the truth could be shown, but ignored, rejected? What chance did she have if the truth couldn't even change the course of humanity? "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It can't be like that. I won't let it." The figure didn't move, didn't respond to her outburst. He simply stood there, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The tension between them was suffocating, and Marie felt a cold sweat forming on her forehead. "You can't stop it," he said flatly. "The truth will unfold, but not in the way you hope. People will turn away from it. People will ignore it. And the world will burn because of it." Her pulse quickened. "So there's no hope?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Hope is a fragile thing," he replied. "But it still exists. Just not in the way you expect. You cannot save everyone. You cannot save the world. But you can try." His words were a haunting echo, the finality of his tone pushing Marie to the brink of despair. She wasn't sure whether he was offering a warning or a judgment, but it felt like the same thing. It felt like there was no way out. "Then what do you expect me to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I've been given this vision, this truth. But what do I do with it? What am I supposed to do?" The figure turned slightly, as though he was preparing to leave. "You will find out," he said simply. "When the time comes, you will understand." And with that, he faded into the light once more, leaving Marie standing alone, her heart heavy, her mind racing. The world outside continued on, oblivious to the weight of the truth she now carried. She didn't know what to do with it. She didn't know what was supposed to come next. But the man's words, his warning, echoed in her mind like a distant drumbeat. Time was running out. The world was slipping toward its end. And she was the only one who could see it. Grace stood alone in the quiet expanse, her mind filled with the unsettling weight of the truth that the figure had shared with her. He had warned her. He had shown her what the future would look like if the world refused to open its eyes to the truth. And now, she had to make sense of it all. But how? She had been thrust into this strange and overwhelming reality, this space that wasn't bound by the rules of the world she had known. The world that had been so clear to her, the one where she worked, where she helped people face their final moments, seemed distant now, like a dream. She was no longer bound by the constraints of her human body, and yet she wasn't entirely free. She was caught in this in-between space, surrounded by nothing and everything at once. Her body no longer ached with the weight of her duties, no longer felt the exhaustion of the long shifts, no longer carried the familiar scars of years spent caring for others. And yet, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her in this place was far heavier. She could feel it in every breath she took, in every thought that spiraled through her mind. The words of the figure, the cryptic statements that seemed to offer little comfort or guidance, echoed through her, reverberating inside her chest like a drumbeat. "What do I do?" she whispered to the empty space around her, the question raw with desperation. "How am I supposed to fix this? How am I supposed to make people see what I've seen? How am I supposed to change the course of all of this?" She could feel herself spinning, the room beginning to close in around her, as if the very walls of this strange world were narrowing in on her. There was no answer, no way to find a path out of the confusion. The figure had told her that the truth would unfold, that she would understand in time, but time was something she had no control over in this place. She was lost in the darkness of uncertainty. Then, something shifted. It wasn't a sound and it wasn't a voice, but she felt it, a pulse, like the beat of a heart. Her own heart skipped a beat, and she felt an undeniable shift in the air. The pressure that had been building inside her chest suddenly loosened. She looked up, instinctively searching for the source, but there was nothing. No figure, no light, no explanation. But the feeling was unmistakable. She was being watched. And it wasn't just the figure from before. Something else was here. Something watching her every move. She could feel it in the air, like an electric charge, swirling around her and in the space she occupied. Her body tensed. Her breathing quickened. She wasn't alone anymore, and she knew it wasn't just the figure, the one who had brought her here and shown her what she had seen. No, this was something different. Something far more dangerous. And then, from the shadows, a voice whispered, low, like a breath against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. You still don't understand? The words sliced through the air, their edge sharp and cutting. They weren't the same comforting, measured tones of the figure who had guided her this far. No, this voice was colder, more menacing. It was as if the very air had turned toxic. Grace whipped around, trying to see where the voice had come from, but there was nothing, only the vast expanse of light and shadows stretching before her. Her heart raced, and she felt the floor beneath her sway. She wasn't sure if she was about to fall or if the very space itself was shifting. She reached out, steadying herself against something solid that shouldn't have existed in a place like this. Who are you? She demanded, her voice cracking but rising with defiance. What do you want from me? From the darkness ahead, the voice returned, still just a whisper, but now with a sense of amusement, mocking, taunting. We are not who you think we are, Grace. We are the keepers, the ones who watch, the ones who hold the threads of fate. And we know that you have been given the truth. But what you don't understand is that the truth you've been shown is not the only truth. Grace's pulse raced. What does that mean? She asked, her voice trembling. She had heard that voice before, but it wasn't the figure that had guided her. This was something darker, something that felt ancient, like a shadow of the very earth itself. It means that what you've seen is just the beginning. You've witnessed the decline, the fall of everything. But that's not all there is. What you don't know, what you haven't seen, is that the worst is yet to come. The devastation will be greater than you can imagine. She shook her head. No, I've already seen it. I've seen what happens. I saw the end, the suffering, the darkness. The voice chuckled darkly. The end is coming us, but it won't be as you think. The truth isn't always what it seems, Grace. You think you know the path, but there's more. There's always more. And you've only seen a glimpse. Grace's mind reeled with the implications of the words. She had thought she had seen the worst, but this was something else. The more she heard, the more confused she became. She was being told that everything she knew, everything she had seen, wasn't the full picture. There was something worse, something far beyond the horrors she had witnessed. Her breath came quicker. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice shaky but firm. What do you want me to do with all of this? The voice didn't answer right away, but the silence stretched, heavy and filled with unspoken threats. Grace could feel her body trembling, her hands clenched into fists, though she was unsure of what she was supposed to do next. What was the right response? How could she stand up against something so vast, so unknowable? You will understand soon enough, the voice finally whispered. But know this, Grace, you cannot escape your role. You cannot run from what's coming. And when the time comes, you will be forced to make a choice. A choice that will determine the fate of everything. The voice faded, and the pressure in the air seemed to lift slightly, but not entirely. It left behind a lingering sense of dread, an unease that settled deep within her chest. Marie's heart was still racing, her mind spinning with the weight of what she had just been told. She had been shown the future, but now she knew that the future was even darker than she had ever imagined. She was facing something far worse than she could have ever dreamed. She wasn't just an observer in this process. She was part of it, a key player in whatever this was. And whatever this choice was that was waiting for her, it was coming, and she had no idea what it would mean for her or for the world. The figure had told her that the truth would unfold, but it seemed the truth was now more dangerous than ever before. The air around Grace crackled with an unseen energy as the mysterious voice from the shadows seemed to linger in the corners of her mind. It wasn't just the fear of what was coming next that made her feel trapped, it was the knowledge that she had to face it. Her very existence had been shifted, her reality twisted by forces beyond her comprehension. She had crossed over into a place that was neither here nor there, and now she was stuck in the grip of something that was slowly unraveling her understanding of everything she thought she knew. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "What do you want from me?" she asked once again, the words coming out more forcefully this time, as if the sheer act of speaking might break the tension in the air. But the voice, the presence in the shadows, didn't answer immediately. It was as if it wanted her to wait, to stew in her own confusion, before delivering its final blow. The longer she stood there, the more her mind raced. She felt like she was on the verge of something important, something monumental, but it was always just out of reach. The figure who had been guiding her, showing her the pieces of the future, had vanished. And now she was left in the dark, drowning in the weight of all that had been revealed, but still too far from understanding what it all meant. "You think you have control," the voice spoke again, and this time, it was closer, just behind her. "You think you can change it, that you can fix the world. But you are nothing. You are powerless." Grace felt a shiver run down her spine, her chest tightening with every word. "I'm not powerless," she whispered, though she wasn't even sure she believed it anymore. "I can make a difference. I've seen the truth. I can stop it." The voice laughed, a sound like the rattle of dry leaves. "Stop it," it mocked. "You think you can stop it? You think you, just a nurse, just a fleeting speck in the grand design, can change what's already been set in motion? You are no one. Nothing but a witness to the inevitable." The weight of those words struck her like a physical blow. She had tried to fight against what she was being shown, tried to make sense of it, tried to understand how she could intervene, but the more she fought, the more she was made to feel small, insignificant. The truth that had once seemed so empowering now felt suffocating, and the more she heard, the less she understood what to do with it. But she refused to back down. "I won't be a bystander," she said, her voice rising with defiance. "I won't stand here and do nothing while the world falls apart. I can change it." The voice in the shadows seemed to grow louder, more forceful. "You have no idea what you're up against, do you? You think you're the hero in this story, the one who gets to save everyone. But you're not. You're just a tool. A puppet in a much bigger game." She felt the words like a slap, her heart pounding in her chest as the reality of her helplessness began to sink in. She had seen the end, the destruction. She had been told that it was too late. And now, the voice was telling her that she had no power, that her efforts were nothing but a fleeting illusion. She was just one person, and the world was far beyond saving. "No," Grace said, shaking her head, her hands trembling. "I'm not going to let this happen. I won't let you win." A bitter laugh echoed in the darkness. "You still don't get it, do you?" the voice hissed. "You don't even know who you're dealing with. You're so far out of your depth that you can't even see the end when it's right in front of you." The figure stepped into the dim light, his form more solid now. He was tall, his features obscured by shadows, but his eyes glowed with a malevolent intensity. The presence around him seemed to distort the air, as if the very atmosphere bent to his will. He was no longer just a disembodied voice. He was real. And he was here, standing in front of her, his gaze like a vice gripping her soul. "You think you can change the future," he spat. "You think your little act of defiance will matter in the grand scheme of things. But it won't. You'll fail. And when you do, you'll realize that all of this entire ordeal, the truth you've seen, was never about you. It was always about them. The ones who will never see, never change. You're just a pawn, a tool. And when this is all over, you will be forgotten, just like everyone else." Grace's breath caught in her throat as his words landed like poison in her mind. Every ounce of hope, every shred of resolve that she had clung to seemed to crumble with each syllable he spoke. It was as if the man had found a way to expose the deepest insecurities buried in her heart and was now using them against her. "You're nothing. You'll fail." The words rang in her mind, but there was something else beneath the surface. A crack in his confidence. A flicker of something unsteady in his eyes, something that suggested he, too, was aware of the vastness of the situation. Despite his cruelty, his harsh words, something told her that his power wasn't absolute. With a burst of courage she hadn't known she still had, Grace stepped toward him, her voice steady now, though her chest tightened with every word. "I won't give up," she said. "I will fight. You can mock me, you can belittle me, but you won't stop me." For a moment, the figure's face twisted with something close to rage. His features darkened, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You still don't understand," he snarled. "You can't win. You will never win. You are a fool to think you can fight against what's already been decided." Grace stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "I will not back down," she thought, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. This man, this presence, was pushing every button, exploiting every vulnerability she had. But something inside her, something deeper than fear or uncertainty, refused to let him have the last word. The man's figure seemed to swell with an overpowering force, the air around him crackling with dark energy. It felt like the entire world was tilting, like the very foundation of reality itself was shifting beneath their feet. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, and Grace could feel her strength begin to waver. The weight of his words, of his presence, was crushing her. "You think this is your victory?" he sneered. "You think you can walk away from this unscathed? You can't escape what's coming. It's already too late. The choices have been made, and now you will face the consequences. Just like everyone else." The silence stretched between them, heavy with finality, and the figure began to fade again, his shadow swallowing him whole. But Grace's heart still raced, her mind spinning with everything he had said. She felt smaller, weaker than she had before, and yet, somehow, something inside her had shifted. His words had shaken her, yes, but they hadn't broken her. And as the last traces of his presence vanished into the air, Grace was left standing in the silence, unsure of where to go next, unsure of what she was meant to do. But one thing was certain, the fight was far from over. Grace stood in the stillness, her breath shallow, heart pounding. The figure's taunts echoed in her mind like an endless drumbeat. She could feel the weight of his words pressing on her chest, suffocating her, but there was something else now, something shifting within her. The despair, the crushing doubt, had begun to give way to something darker, something that threatened to consume the fear that had paralyzed her. She had failed. She had let him break her, or so she thought. As the darkness began to recede, a wave of calm swept over her. She didn't understand what it was, but it felt as though she was stepping into a new phase. The fear she had clung to so tightly before seemed to melt away, and in its place was clarity. She could still feel the echoes of the figure's presence, but now it felt distant, disconnected, as if he were no longer holding power over her. Grace took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. She knew the consequences. She knew what had been shown to her. The suffering, the destruction, the certainty of it all. And yet, in that brief silence, something changed. Something clicked within her, as though she had finally begun to understand the truth that wasn't just about the end of the world, but about her role in it. Suddenly, she wasn't alone. The figure appeared again, his shadow casting a cold chill over the space. He stood tall, silent, his presence commanding as always, but something about him had shifted. There was a flicker in his eyes, a trace of hesitation, a subtle vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "You've learned nothing," the figure sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can change things. You think you can stop the inevitable. You can't. This world, this existence, is bound to fail. And you are just one small, fragile part of it." Grace took a step toward him, a quiet determination in her gaze. She had seen the way his demeanor had changed, how his confidence had wavered in the wake of her resolve. His eyes, though filled with hatred, now seemed uncertain, as if he was questioning something he had long believed. He wasn't as invincible as he once seemed. "You've underestimated me," she said, her voice strong, but tinged with something darker, something she hadn't felt before. "You think you know everything, but you don't. You think the world is set in stone, but you've forgotten one thing: the power of choice. It's not too late. I won't let it be." The figure's lips curled into a mockingly thin smile. "You're wrong," he spat. "You've already lost. And now, it's your turn to suffer the consequences." Before she could react, the space around them shifted. The air became colder, heavier, and she could feel the ground beneath her shift, like the earth itself was shifting to reject her. The light dimmed to an eerie gray, and she could feel a deep, bone-chilling cold seeping into her very soul. But it wasn't just the environment that changed. There was a new force in the air, an overwhelming weight pressing down on her. The air seemed to thicken, and suddenly she could see it: shadows, twisting, writhing at the edges of her vision. Creatures that had no form, no faces, only eyes, empty, hollow eyes that stared into her soul. The figure's face twisted into something monstrous as the shadows surged, swallowing the light around him. "You think you can fight this? You think you can fight me?" he hissed, his voice growing louder, more guttural. "You're nothing. You can't change what's coming. No one can." Grace's body trembled, but it wasn't fear that surged through her veins. It was anger, raw, unbridled. She had been forced to witness this world's fall, to be shown a future of pain, of loss, of hopelessness. But now she understood. This figure wasn't the ultimate force in this reality. He was just one part of a greater scheme, one piece of a puzzle that she could still help to solve.